One of my hopes is to be able to change your intuitions about what counts as physical, and to perhaps change your intuitions about information and informational causation. This segment might be a bit hard to understand because it tries to overcome long-standing intuitions we have about causation and the physical, but let's try and see how far we can get. People typically have an intuition of what the physical is, rooted in the idea of a substantial material or weighty substance. Often people intuit the magnitude of the fundamental substance, presumed to be energy, in terms of amounts, like varying masses of, say, clay. We learn in school that energy is a substance that can neither be created nor destroyed, a fact that we might intuit using a metaphor like the reshaping of clay, which obviously does not and cannot change its amount. If we change a lump of clay from the shape of a man to the shape of a house, it obviously remains the same amount of clay. More abstract models of the fundamental substance that we learned about in school centered on the concepts of the amplitude and frequency of energy. We learned to picture light as having an amplitude and a frequency, that we modeled as a wave whose height corresponded to the light's amplitude and whose spatial wavelength corresponded to its temporal frequency or color. Common intuitions based on these kinds of models can really lead us astray in our efforts to understand what information is and how it can be causal in the universe. In my view, physicalists, and I count myself as a physicalist, need to re-evaluate what we mean by the physical to accommodate information and downward informational causation because, I will argue, information is fundamentally realized in and is about patterns of energy, not amounts of energy. Whereas it makes sense to reduce global forces to the sums of local forces, and total amounts to the sum of local parts amounts, this kind of reductionism does not make sense at all for patterns. Reductionism of global patterns to local parts of patterns and ultimately to local particle interactions fails as a program because patterns are inherently relational over space, time, and other dimensions. For example, color relationships, social relationships, and so on. That is, patterns and relationships are not localistic. They're globalistic, so reducing them to a level where the decoder can no longer decode the pattern or relationships in question is pointless. The program of reductionistic physicalism, which conceivably could have worked for energetic amplitude and frequency, is doomed to fail for energetic relationships in space and time or the decoding of such patterns. Understanding causation at the level of information will require a holistic understanding of energy because patterns are holistic or relational, and acts of decoding patterns have to occur at a level where those relationships are explicit, not implicit. Patterns cannot be reduced to a level below the level where the relationships that a decoder responds to are present, or the pattern of relationships to which a decoder is sensitive will be lost. But if an act of decoding can trigger a change in a physical system, say a neuron that's tuned to a face, detects a face in the visual input and then fires, thereby influencing other neurons, then reductionistic physicalism won't work at all because then even non-informational causal chains, say among local particles, become influenced by global energetic relationships. That is, once patterns and information become causal in the universe because of the evolution of decoders, like neurons, that do things if patterns are present, like fire, or trigger behaviors of animals in the world, then reductionistic physicalism fails. Reductionism fails for the entire universe, even if it fails just here on Earth. For example, when we look at the night sky, we might recognize the constellation Orion. The same set of stars could have been linked together in some different pattern, but this is the pattern we detect. Why? Well, somebody taught this pattern to us, perhaps when we were small, so we learned the pattern of this constellation and now can find the pattern in the night sky. But there's nothing like Orion really out there in the universe. Sure, there are several suns really out there, but these are in fact hundreds of light years apart from each other and from us. The only reason Orion has an existence as a pattern is that we have learned to have a decoder that responds when an Orion-like pattern is in the input. Had we been taught a different pattern, then, when looking at the night sky, we would have seen that other pattern and not the pattern of Orion. And that these stars cast this pattern, even though far apart, is because of the position that the Earth just happens to occupy. So Orion only exists because we learned this pattern and can detect it in the visual input when we look at the night sky because of the arbitrary position of the Earth. The pattern has no objective existence as a thing with mass in the universe out there. It exists solely because we decode it as a pattern in our sensory inputs. And the pattern does not have to exist among stars either. We could recognize the pattern Orion if it were made by arranging limes or teddy bears or whatever we like. Another concrete example is afforded by the moon. Most people in the West see a face in the moon, but most people in China are taught that there is a rabbit in the moon. The first time I was told this, I thought it was quite ridiculous because I thought it was obvious that the moon looked like it had a face on it. But after it was shown to me how to see a rabbit in the moon, I found it actually more natural to see a rabbit in the moon. Of course, there's no face in the moon or rabbit in the moon. This is just how I have been taught to decode the pattern on the moon. But it does show how identical input from A, in this case the moon, can lead to radically different outcomes, say how I see the moon, once moon decoder B has been reparametrized. To make informational causation even more alien to the causation studied by physics and described by our best physical laws, spatiotemporal patterns of energy can be created and destroyed, so conservation laws, whether of energy or of momentum or of spin and so forth, that apply to amounts of energy are not relevant to understanding informational causation. For example, going back to our clay example, when I form a lump of clay into a little man and then into a little house, the amount of clay is conserved, but the shape of the clay is not conserved because I destroyed the form of the man in order to mold the form of a house. So form is not conserved. Pattern in general is not conserved. Information, being acts of decoding patterns, is similarly not conserved. Thus, information does not obey the conservation laws of physics, even if it's realized in a material basis that does obey the laws of physics. And if information is rooted in acts of pattern decoding, then informational causation is about successions of pattern decoding acts, where the occurrence of one act of pattern decoding plays a role in the occurrence of a subsequent act of pattern decoding. Ideas that were central for understanding standard physical causation among particles, such as amount, force, frequency, and conservation of energy or momentum, are just no longer very relevant or useful, and in fact may hinder our thinking about informational causation. To understand informational causation means to understand decoding, particularly the decoding of energetic patterns among inputs to the decoder. It requires understanding how decoders trigger other decoders, and also how decoders reparameterize each other for possible future acts of now altered decoding. The technical word for energetic relationships is phase. For example, a sine and cosine wave of the same amplitude and frequency have a phase difference of 90 degrees. Spatial phase arises from spatial relationships, for example, patterns, and is related to the everyday idea of shape. Temporal phase is related to the idea of timing. Physicalists' intuitions have been centered on the amount or frequency of energy, leading to the misleading intuition that causation must involve the transfer of a conserved quantity of energy. But if we instead focus on energetic phase relationships, which can vary independently of both amplitude and frequency, we can reconceive causation as occurring among patterns that trigger patterns, and among acts of decoding patterns that trigger acts of decoding patterns, none of which are conserved, and none of which apply forces or have amounts. When we think of causation among energetic patterns afforded by acts of decoding patterns that then change the system, we enter a new causal world where there are no informational forces and nothing informational is conserved. If information just is acts of decoding inputs, such acts set up equivalence classes of outcomes among physical events. if those equivalence classes have to do with criteria that have to be met in order to count as an instance of a certain class, then neither the class nor its members is defined by physical attributes of particles such as mass, momentum, wavelength, or position. An informational class is defined by the meeting of informational criteria, which are in turn realized in the satisfaction of physical criteria for neural firing placed on spatial configurations and temporal patterns, again, phase relationships among inputs, and ultimately particles. For example, the class of things that count as a hat has nothing to do with momentum, spin, mass, or particle positions. Importantly, neither an informational class nor an informational configuration or pattern has an objective or object-like existence in addition to the particles in which the pattern is realized. A pattern or configuration only comes into existence and becomes causal in the universe by virtue of a decoder that decodes its inputs such that if this pattern is present, the decoder does something to the physical system in which it is embedded, perhaps causing the system to change its physical and informational state. In order to understand what allows one act of decoding to trigger subsequent different acts of decoding, we must first understand what counts as an act of decoding for a neuron. Successful decoding of inputs occurs when an instance from the class of all combinations of inputs that could make the neuron fire in fact occurs as input to the neuron, making it fire. But what defines this class of potential information? A neuron will generally fire only when a certain number of action potentials arrives within an extremely short duration, say within about 25 milliseconds. The inputs must share very particular temporal and spatial phase relationships. For example, they have to arrive simultaneously, and they have to arrive on very particular parts of the neuron before the neuron will decode the input as an instance of the class that can drive it. An act of neural decoding, therefore, typically involves an assessment of energetic phase. Having decoders respond to particular spatial and temporal relationships or patterns in input allowed patterns or phase in energy to become causal in the universe. Whereas pre-biological classes of physical causation generally were unresponsive to phase differences in input, being more responsive to other attributes of energy such as amplitude and frequency, life introduced phase causation or pattern causation into the universe, as far as we know, for the first time right here on our Earth. Informational causation occurs when there is a succession of pattern decoding events, as when the firing of this neuron, tuned to pattern A, in part drives the firing of another neuron, tuned to pattern B. But informational causation is more powerful even than that because the criteria that a neuron applies to evaluate its inputs can change or be changed by other neurons' inputs. This subclass of informational causation is made possible in the human brain via the resetting of the informational parameters that will drive a neuron, realized in resetting synaptic weights and other parameters so that a neuron now effectively receives and responds to different driving inputs than it did before the act of resetting. Thus, informational causation is realized in criterial causation, which is itself an instance of the more general class of energetic phase causation or pattern causation.